Welcome back to the Religion Unplugged podcast. This is Matthew Peterson, and today I'll be talking with Loyola professor and author Dr. Joseph Vukov about his recent book, Staying Human in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. Dr. Vukov, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Matthew. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I think just to get started, I kind of like to do a little bit of term definition.
As a
You had to write.
philosopher, that makes me happy.
Okay, good, good. So I'm going to ask you a very important term definition, very big. So please answer as short or as long as you want it to be. You talk about staying human, and if we're going to talk about staying human, I think we need to first establish what is being human. Can you break down what you mean when you say staying human?
Yeah, I mean it in two senses. So the first sense of staying human is having an understanding of who we are, as in what it means to be a human being. And of course, there's rival views about what that looks like. So some people might defend a view that says we're pure spirit. Others might defend a view that says we're pure biological animals. I defend a view in the book that says we're somewhere in between, that we're essentially embodied, but yet also in part immaterial. But that's the first part of staying human, is really in an era of artificial intelligence, making sure that we go forward with an idea of exactly who we are as human beings. Then I think if we've done that work first, it will clarify a lot of the conversations down the road. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is staying human in how we act. So in how we act in response to each other, in how we react to ourselves and understand ourselves, and then also in terms of our relationship with God. So I think that there's sort of this, you could call it the internal, the inward looking dimension of staying human. That's what exactly am I? Then there's the outward dimension of staying human, which is how does my understanding of myself translate into how I relate with others?
Yeah, yeah, totally. That's very helpful. And you kind of touched on body and soul, and that's something a really important theme throughout the whole book is your kind of knocking down of Gnosticism and how you think it's such an essential part of the whole conversation. Can you break down what your fundamental problem is with Gnosticism and why it's so integral to the conversation about AI?
Yeah, I might take your second question first. So I think
Mm-hmm.
so what Gnosticism, the way I understand it in the book, and Gnosticism is not so much one theory as a collection of theories, and there's religious aspects to it as well that I don't get into as much. But the way I understand Gnosticism is essentially as a view that tries to flee from or reject the human body as essential to who we are. So it's a view that says what the human really is something immaterial. Maybe it's coupled to the position that part of the point of life is to get rid of our material being, or to try and get rid of the material world in order to become purely immaterial in the afterlife or something like that. And the reason I think it's a real crucial theory to understand in conversations about AI is that while Gnosticism is no longer a religion that you can check in a religious demographic survey, right? You can't go attend a Gnostic service this Sunday. It still is, I think, a really, really influential way of thinking about ourselves. I think there is all sorts of way in which we think about ourselves as being disembodied or as essentially immaterial. And I think that once you've made that move, all of a sudden you get a lot more confused when you start looking at artificial intelligence. Why? Because you've taken the human body out of the equation, or at least you've said that it's not particularly important. And once you've made that move, then all of a sudden, what I take to be the most obvious difference between human intelligences and artificial intelligences is the fact that we have bodies and we're biological beings, and computer servers aren't that. But as soon as you've made that Gnostic move, all of a sudden this really crucial and obvious difference starts to become less important, or seemingly less important. So part of what I want to do in the book is to say, sort of point out, here's what Gnosticism is. Here's how it's often operative in our conversations about artificial intelligence. And here's alternative ways to understand the human person that maybe make it more obvious why ourselves and machines are something different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you know, you talk about this creation of uh machines, and that's we're kind of you wrestle with this one guy who claims that there is an AI that is essentially a person. He thinks it's
Yeah.
become sentient. He believes it's a person. Um, and you believe that that's totally impossible. Can you break down why that's impossible?
Yeah. So the guy is this guy, Blake Lemoine, and you might not remember him now, but Google him, look him up. He made all the morning show podcast circuit about 2 or 3 years ago. So Blake was an AI expert working at Google, and he had been working with this particular program called Lambda, and he was convinced that the program had become sentient. So it was kind of a thing, sort of like Chat GPT. There was some extra stuff added in as well, but it's kind of like you can imagine working with Chat GPT, and all of a sudden he thinks, oh, this is responding in ways that I just don't think something that was purely machine could. So I think that the right thing to conclude here is that it's sentient or conscious or maybe even a person. Now, I don't think he's right. So I think there's some mistakes that Blake's made along the way. But I actually think that he's drawing out some important conclusions from a position that a lot of people accept today. So as I was kind of looking at some of Blake's interviews, what was really interesting is when he was sort of in the national spotlight, almost everyone characterized him as a bit of a loony, right? It was, here's Blake Lemoine who thinks this computer is sentient, and isn't that just crazy? And we'll see why he thinks that. I think that was a misguided move because I actually think that according to dominant ways of understanding the human person, Blake was saying exactly the kind of things that he should be expected to be saying. So according to really dominant ways of understanding the human person, and I talk about this in the book, um, the way we should understand humans is essentially according to our computational abilities. So what we really are is our ability to perform really sophisticated intellectual computational functions. And according to that way of understanding who we are, as soon as a computer becomes as sophisticated as us, well, then it may as well be human, right? It's captured the essence of who we are. And this is not a niche theory. This is very mainstream cognitive science and philosophy. The $10 word, it's called functionalism. Um, and this functionalist idea basically says, no, all humans are is really sophisticated computers. So once a computer catches up, I think that Blake is actually just teasing out the implication and basically saying, hey, we were all thinking that all humans are is sophisticated computers. And at this point, they've caught up. We should do the honest thing and say, they're really people now, or they're really conscious now, or they're really sentient now. And what I want to say is, good Blake on teasing out the implications of that theory. But rather than concluding that the machines have become conscious, we need to dial things back and revisit our theory of what the human being is. And maybe it turns out that the human being is more than just a sophisticated computing machine, so that computers, even when they become as sophisticated as we are in some sense, they actually aren't catching up to or eclipsing our humanity.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many interesting different rabbit trails you can go down when it comes to us creating like consciousnesses, and I'm wondering, as a Christian, how was researching all of this and taking in all this information, how did it affirm your faith, and how did it maybe scare you in ways of you just saw like the sin of humanity, and the ways that we talk about ourselves and talk about what we are capable of. Yeah, just speak to that if you can.
Yeah, I it actually excites me. So I think that
Hmm.
there's a real opportunity for Christians here in several ways as we're interacting with AI. One is what you just mentioned, is that AI notoriously sometimes goes off the rails,
Hmm.
and it says really racist things, or it says completely false things. There's just made up stuff that AI will do. So there's all sorts of problems that happen with AI, and it can be tempting to either blame it on the machine or to say, well, it's just kind of a silly failure, right? And it's kind of laughable and laugh it off. And I think both of those are missed opportunities, especially for the Christian, because I think that if you understand the way an AI works and how it's built, it actually can be a really helpful insight into the themes that you were just mentioning, things like sin and fallenness. So the way an AI works, roughly, and I'm not a computer scientist, so this is an amateur perspective. But the way an AI works is that you give the AI a whole bunch of what's called training data. So in the case of something like ChatGPT, you're giving it loads and loads of text. Or everyone's by now seen the AIs that can produce images, right? The way those are trained is you give them scores and scores of images. And then eventually it starts to recognize patterns in those images or text, and that's how it does the things that it does. What this means is that when an AI goes off the rails, whether it's, again, saying something really inappropriate or whether it's just saying things that are false, it actually is, in a really essential way, holding a mirror up to ourselves. It's kind of a distorted mirror in that it might highlight something that we hadn't quite noticed was there before, or it might bring out some misinformation that had been buried really deep somewhere on the internet or in something that sort of, this essay that it was used to, part of the data that it was trained on. It pulls that out. And what the Christian can say there, and I as a Christian can say, is that what that's actually doing is giving us a really interesting window into ourselves. And the problems with AI are, in some ways, yet another confirmation of human sinfulness, because an AI's outputs are ultimately reflections of our humanity.
Mm.
And that's what can make it existentially disturbing. But I think the opportunity here is to look at when it does go wrong, to realize that's me. That's my humanity being reflected there. And I can't blame it on the machine. And it's not just laughable. This is an occasion for me to reflect a little bit more on my own nature and my sinful nature and the sinful nature of all of us humans.
Yeah, and if it's, if all of AI, everything that it makes is just kind of, in a sense, I guess, reinterpreting information that we've plugged into it. I think a lot about the effects that AI might have on art, and I'm a big poetry enjoyer, and I like you spend a second in the book talking about plugging in poetry prompts to AI and it's spitting out kind of unremarkable stuff. But inevitably, it's going to get better. And I think my question is: do you believe that AI is ever capable of invention, of actual creativity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess part of it depends, going back to your first question on how we define terms.
Mm,
Is it capable of churning out prose or images that have never been created before?
mm,
Absolutely, yes. I mean, even rudimentary AI is capable of spitting out, here's an essay that maybe isn't all that great, but hey, it's never been written before. So
mm,
in that way, if you sort of set the bar low on what creativity or invention is, then it's been answered for you. Yeah, it can do
mm,
that. But what I would say, and I think the thought experiment that I like to run here is to imagine, and you mentioned already, it's going to get better and better. So let's suppose that eventually it really does create poems or artworks that are superficially indistinguishable from what a human poet or a human artist might create, right? So we look at them both, and I'm a philosopher, so I get to do weird thought experiments. We could say they actually, miracle upon miracles, you produce the exact same thing, right?
mm,
So here's the poem written by Matthew, and here's the poem written by ChatGPT, and coincidence of coincidences, they're word for word identical.
right.
As the ChatGPT in this case written poetry? Has it genuinely created? And again, on a superficial understanding of that, it's obvious the answer is yes, right? It's written something original. But I think if you press on that idea of creativity and writing, I think it becomes clear that there's a deeper sense in which it hasn't. So when I engage with poetry, and I'm a big fan of poetry too, and of art, it's not just that I'm literally looking at the superficial words in front of me. That's part of what I'm doing. But I'm also, in a very real way, engaging with the person who wrote them.
Mm,
I'm engaging with a person who had a particular outlook in a particular time and space, who is embedded in a particular history.
mm,
T.S. Eliot's one of my favorites, right? And the more you learn about T.S. Eliot and the period he's writing in, the more that the poetry starts to become the work of art that it is. So I would say that the superficial act of creation is not the whole thing. And that because of that, there's these human aspects to the creation of art and creation of poetry. And by the way, that's just the creator end. There's also the recipient end, right? So it matters that I am reading the poem in a New York City coffee shop or in the Chicago suburbs or in my easy chair at night, right? That's an important part of the artwork as well. And that sort of relational, deeper aspect of engagement of art is, I think, something that gets missed sometimes in the talk about AI, because that's what we're glossing over. And one worry I have is that we miss the difference along the way, and that we say, oh, it's superficially the same. It's doing the thing, right? It's
Mm.
creating art, it's writing poetry. And I would say that no, it's really not doing the whole thing, actually.
Yeah, and I just as a thought, is there a world in which, we train a program to we make a big collage of a lot of different people's lives, and we create this life for this program, and we teach this program, that it, I don't know, grew up in Maryland and went to school in Arizona. We give it all these stuff. Its grandma died at 13 or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a world where we give it so many, we give it an original story, and it's able to, and then we say, okay, give me 30 poems? Is there any world where those are, we can look at those as kind of an original thing, or as something of more substance, or as even close to the substance of an actual human written poem?
Yeah, I think you're starting to fill in some of the blanks there. So
Mm.
I think if there's a story, all of a sudden that starts to look more human. If there's a history,
Mm-hmm.
that starts to look more human. Um, in a way, though, it's a superficial similarity
Right.
because we've given it the story.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't lived its story. We've programmed it in certain ways, right? I've directed it. We've decided your grandma dies at 13 and you grow up here and you go to college in New York and then you get an internship in Chicago and so on. Where, of course, anyone who's actually lived a human life knows that that's not how it goes. In fact, the stories that we write for ourselves or try to write for ourselves are often redirected in drastic ways by other people in our lives and our environments. And that's an important part of being human. So, yeah, I mean, I think that in a way that's starting to close the gap a little bit, because you're saying, okay, so story and history is an important part of creation and the creative process, or being a person and writing poetry. Um, but again, I think that when you actually start to poke on it, what you're doing is you're adding in a superficial similarity that actually isn't getting to the deep similarity. So yeah, I think what I would say is, even if you did all that, you're still not actually getting poetry or art creation, because you haven't created a human being, and human beings are who create art and write poetry.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Um, there's another thing that you talk about that I find, personally, I find pretty intimidating, which is that, uh, you say a lot of the programmers who work on really complex AI systems, at a certain point, um, they stop understanding them, and they just keep turning knobs, pressing buttons until stuff works, but they don't understand it. Is there any, do we have any context for anything that humanity has created before, where we've gotten to the point where we made it and then we don't understand how it works, that could help us as we interpret, like, how we use AI in the future, and build AI in the future?
Yeah, it might be a new aspect of AI. So
Mm.
I like to try and emphasize the ways in which AI is not something different in all respects. So every time there's a new technology that we're forced to grapple with, whether it's the written word, whether it's the printing press, whether it's radio or television or the internet or social media, I think that there are questions that parallel the questions that we're asking right now about AI. That said,
Mm.
I think there are really genuine differences in AI as opposed to previous technologies. The one that you just mentioned, I think, is a really important one. Our ability to understand artificial intelligence um, is much diminished when compared with previous technologies. Um, yeah, so you mentioned even the programmers who put it together. There's a limit to how much and if they're able to compute sort of all the different ways in which an AI is functioning. Um, and that's something new, because I don't know how my computer works, for instance, but somebody does somewhere, where an AI, from what I understand, you actually can if you take a long, long time and do really sophisticated calculations, you can, in principle, trace it back to what was going on.
Mm.
Um, but you're never going to do that because of just how complicated the machine. You're never going to get the whole picture, basically. Um, and that's something genuinely new. I think the other thing that's genuinely new about AI, there's probably some other things too, but is the fact that with AI, unlike other previous technologies, we really do face these existential questions about our own nature. So, no one, after the invention of the printing press, looked at the printing press and said, that's replicating what I thought had been a distinctively human activity. Like, is that a person? Is it conscious? Is it sentient? Same thing with radio, TV, even the internet and social media, impressive as those are. We didn't look at them and think, what exactly is this thing that I've created? It seems to be mimicking human activities in a really existentially frightening way, where that is the reaction we're seeing with AI. So I think that, again, there are similarities with previous technologies, but there are also important differences, both in our comprehension of it and also, I think, in our confrontation with it and seeing something that looks a lot like us.
Yeah. And obviously you said that you don't believe we can create, or at least we haven't created a consciousness, an actual sentient computer. And but as far as like, obviously there are people trying to do that. Is that do you believe that that is not only like aimless but immoral? Is that us trying to play God in a way to create our own beings?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the answer to your first question answers the second. So I think it is
Okay.
aimless, and because
Okay.
of that, I'm not sure if it's immoral because I think
Mm.
it's if they could do it, I might have more reservations, but I actually think that it's a fool's errand in many ways. And the
Mm.
reason for that, it's some things that we've already talked about a little bit. I think that when you really stop and think about what human consciousness is, it starts to become clear that artificial intelligence isn't it and could never be it. So here's what I
Mm.
mean. Can AI replicate certain computational functions that humans carry out? Um, yeah, that's what it's really good at doing, right? And there's sort of one aspect of our intelligence is could be expressed in terms of inputs and outputs, right? I'm asked to write an essay and I come up with an essay. I'm asked to create a piece of art, and I guess I can't create the piece of art. I'm a horrible artist, but somebody could create the piece of art. And AI does that kind of computational, correlational type of intelligence really, really well. But there's other aspects of intelligence that, again, even a moment's reflection, it's just clear that it can't do it. So think about emotional intelligence and relational intelligence. And we've already talked a little bit about embodied intelligence. Um, some of my favorite examples are to think about activities like athletics and dancing and musicianship, all of which are obvious aspects of human intellectual life, right? If you play a musical instrument or play a sport or are a dancer, you know that that's taking a lot of high level cognitive functioning, right? But it also is the kind of cognitive functioning that you couldn't code. It's not the
Mm.
sort of thing that's computational because it's an intelligence that you're performing with your body. Um, I'm not a dancer, but I do play a little bit of guitar. And I know that as soon as you start to approach playing guitar computationally and you think, now to this fret, now to that fret, now I'm going to make a run of exactly these notes. As soon as you think in that way, everything falls apart. The way you have to think when you're playing guitar is by thinking with your fingers. And it's only then that you've developed these habits that you're actually able to run the scales. So that's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question. But um, yeah, all this talk about replicating consciousness in silicon or creating genuine artificial intelligence, I kind of want to say let's backpedal a little bit and think a little bit about exactly what human intelligence is and get the full picture. And is there computational aspects? Sure, but there's also embodied and relational and emotional aspects. And we haven't even started working on that project. So it seems premature and in fact to me impossible to think that we could actually recreate human consciousness in a computer.
Right. That makes sense. And we've covered pretty much everything I want to say, but everything I want to talk about. But I do have one more question for you. Um, I very much I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was very
Thank you.
it's very accessible. I think you write in a way that's you talk about hard, intense things and you strip them down to just so unacademic people like me can read it.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, that
And
was the goal.
right, right. And so as it's kind of the guidebook for this first chapter in what foreseeably is probably a the rest of humanity will probably have be using AI in some way or another. I'm really curious how you're using AI and how you're abstaining from using it. Wait, and even also both kind of what's happening and then also how you might use AI in the future and how you would kind of like to pull back on maybe some of the ways that you have fallen into it right now.
Yeah, it's the question that I really want everyone to ask by the end of the book. So it can be tempting when we think about proper AI use to always put the onus on them, right? To say, well, it's really up to the Silicon Valley people. They've got to make sure to make ethical decisions. And it's really on government regulators to make sure they're regulating things in the right way that require ethical use. And I don't deny that at all. I think that's absolutely true. But I think that sometimes by shifting the burden, we refuse to see what we can do. And what we can do is exactly what you just suggested. It's to think about how we personally can choose to either interact with or abstain from interacting with artificial intelligence. And what I argue in the book is that the right lens through which to view that question is to ask, in what ways does my use of AI, I think you could broaden this out to technology generally, support my humanity and that of others? And in what ways does it detract from my humanity and that of others? So you asked specifically about my AI use. I'll give you one way that I haven't used it. AI, it turns out, writes a really good letter of recommendation for students
Mm-hmm.
applying to grad school or law school or medical school. Maybe even better than the ones I write. I spend a lot of time with my letters of recommendation, but I've seen what it does and it's pretty good. Um, I don't use it for that. Why? Because I understand when a student comes to me and asks me, "Hey, Joe, I'm applying to law school. Can you write me a letter of recommendation?" Um, I always happily say yes. And I feel like the letter writing process is part of that relationship that I have with the student. So even if the product that I produce using an AI could be something as good, if not better, if I was to use the machine, if I was to use an AI to do that, I feel like what I would do in that process is undermine some of my relationship with that student and with another person. I've diminished their humanity. I've diminished my humanity a little bit. Have I crossed an ethical red line in the sand? I wouldn't take it that far. I would just say that no, it would be a dehumanizing practice for me and for this student for me to use an AI to write this letter of recommendation. Um,
Right.
that said, I do use AI in some places. Um, I use autocomplete in email.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's an everyday instance of AI that in some ways is going to be more pervasive than the really flashy stuff. So when you're writing an email and the light gray text comes up saying, "Do you want to complete your sentence this way?" And you can choose, to press tab and it auto completes. That's sort of low level AI, but it's the kind of AI that actually is in some ways more prevalent, right? To use ChatGPT, you've got to go to the website. Every time we open up our email, we're confronted with this choice. And I use it there. Is that dehumanizing? It actually might be a little bit. Writing 100 emails a day is also a little bit dehumanizing. So I think maybe that's my defense is this is just a boilerplate email that I say I'm going to be able to make the meeting and the AI and the email app picked up. That's what I was going to say. Sure, autocomplete away. I'll get the email off and get on to better things and maybe have some time to hang out with my kids. So I think that's the question I want to ask myself. I certainly haven't perfected my own use of it, but I really am trying to ask myself, as I engage with AI, as it becomes more and more prevalent, again, not just on sites like ChatGPT, but in email, it's getting integrated into Word and PowerPoint and Google. It seems to be everywhere now. Is just really asking myself, does this contribute to my own humanity, to the humanity of others, or does this in some way take away from that? And that can be a difficult question to ask, but I think, and to answer, but I think it's at least a good starting point.
Right. I agree. I think that's a very important consideration for everybody to have. And your book certainly, I think, forces people to confront that. So I really appreciate it. And just thank you so much for being here and talking to us. And I think we've covered everything, but really
Awesome.
appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the great questions and the chance to talk with you.